She woke up before the sun, the same way she had for most of her life. The alarm clock didn't shock her anymore. Her body always seemed to know when morning came. She woke gently, slowly, almost carefully, as if the day needed to be eased into rather than rushed. The room around her was familiar. Not fancy, not updated in years, just steady. A dresser that had been there for decades. Curtains that had faded from sunlight, not fashion. A quilt her mother once helped her sew. Everything in its place. Everything the way life had shaped it. The house was quiet. It always was at this hour. Outside, the street still slept. No traffic, no children, no sound except the faint, steady whisper of wind through North Carolina trees. There was something comforting in that quiet, something gentle. She sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, feet resting on the cool floor, letting her thoughts catch up to her body. The same routine, the same rhythm, a life measured in mornings like this. In the kitchen, the coffee warmed slowly on the stove. Not rushed, not loud, just another small part of life built on habit and responsibility. She tied her hair the same way she always had. Not for beauty, not for fashion, just for work. So it would stay out of her face. So the machine wouldn't catch it. So the day could continue like it always had. The textile mill wasn't far. It had been part of her life for so long that distance didn't matter. It wasn't a place you went. It was simply where life led you every morning. The mill had its own presence, its own voice. It wasn't silent like the hills in West Virginia. It wasn't hidden like a coal mine. It was loud, alive, constant. Inside, machines never whispered. They roared. But to her, that noise had always felt like certainty. It meant work existed. It meant life moved on. It meant people were needed. The textile mill stitched more than fabric. It stitched lives together. Hers, her family's, her town's. And then one day, it didn't. She grew up here in North Carolina, in a place where fabric wasn't just something you wore. It was something entire towns were built around. Her mother had worked at the mill. Her aunt had worked at the mill. So had neighbors. So had women she barely knew, but somehow always recognized. In some places, people talked about dreams, about becoming something new. Here, life already had a shape. Children didn't ask, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" They already understood what life looked like. Life was steady. Life was routine. Life was threaded together by work. The mill wasn't just a job. It was a world. It was where people shared news, where they whispered about worries, where they laughed louder than the machines just to hear each other. It was where you found out someone was getting married, or someone was sick, or someone's child had done something they were proud of. It was where life announcements happened in passing sentences. "Did you hear?" She said. "They told me." Life unfolded in threads, just like the fabric did. The first time she walked inside the mill as a worker, the sound almost pushed against her. It wasn't a sound you simply heard. It was a sound you felt. Machines didn't hum softly. They thundered. Rows and rows of moving metal. Spinning spools. Stretching fabric. Snapping thread. Endless repetition. Heat lingered in the air in summer. Cold settled into the concrete in winter. There was never quite enough quiet to think, but enough rhythm to work. Women spoke loudly, because that was the only way to be heard. Yet somehow, nobody ever sounded like they were shouting in anger, just in survival. Hands worked quickly. I stayed focused. Mistakes cost time. Time cost money. Money usually meant food, school clothes, electricity bills, medical visits. So you didn't slow down. You didn't pause unless you had to. You just kept going. She learned quickly. Her hands were steady. Her patience strong. Her ability to endure almost invisible. Nobody clapped for that. Nobody praised endurance. But endurance was what made everything work. Years passed the way thread rolls unwound. Quietly, steadily, constantly, she became faster, more skilled, more reliable, the kind of person managers trusted, the kind of person coworkers leaned on. She didn't think of herself as important. She never saw herself as special. She simply worked, and worked well. She didn't miss many days. She didn't complain loudly, even when she was tired, even when her back ached, even when her hands felt worn. Not because life was easy, but because life needed to continue. The days were long and loud and exhausting, but they made sense. When she left the mill at the end of shift, she knew she had done something real, something that touched the world, even if strangers would never know her name. Shirts she helped stitch would be worn by people she would never meet. Sheets she helped finish would end up in homes she would never see. Uniforms she worked on might follow someone through years of their own life. She never thought of that often, but sometimes the idea drifted through her mind. Her work traveled farther than she ever would. Her identity didn't live in the mirror. It didn't live in photographs. It didn't live in what people said about her. Her identity lived in routine, in showing up, in being dependable, in being part of something bigger than herself, even if nobody called it that. Work wasn't just work. Work was dignity. Work meant she contributed. Work meant she belonged. Work meant she mattered. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, day after day, year after year. Life didn't ask her for speeches. Life asked her to continue, and she did. The years shaped themselves around that rhythm. Wake up, prepare, arrive, work, come home, sleep, begin again. Holidays came and went. Children grew older. People she loved left or passed or drifted away. The mill remained, always there, always loud, always steady. She had learned to measure life not by months or seasons, but by shifts. By days she worked, by days she didn't, by years that seemed to blur into each other. Not because they were meaningless, but because they were so similar, so stable. There was comfort in that kind of predictability, comfort in knowing where you belonged, comfort in knowing what tomorrow looked like. She didn't expect excitement. She didn't need everyone to see her as remarkable. She just wanted life to make sense. And for a long time it did. People sometimes assumed work like hers was small, unimportant, forgettable, but they never understood what truly held a town together. It wasn't speeches. It wasn't people on television. It wasn't the ones making decisions far away. It was the hands that worked quietly, every day, without applause. Hands stitching fabric, hands fixing machines, hands packaging finished rolls, hands that built routine, hands that provided food and shelter, hands that carried families forward. She never thought of herself as a hero. She didn't like big words like that, but there was quiet strength in what she did, a strength nobody talked about much, a strength so ordinary that people forgot how rare it really was. Then gradually something shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and say, this is when it changed. It happened slowly, quietly, almost politely, a whispered rumor in the break room, a conversation someone overheard near management offices, a coworker saying, "Did you hear?" and then hesitating before finishing. Some said work was going to another state. Some said another country. Some said machines would replace more people. Others said it was nothing, just another cycle, just another rumor like the many before it. Factories slowed down sometimes. Order numbers changed. Markets shifted. This had always been part of life. So nobody panicked, at least not out loud. People smiled as if they weren't worried. They laughed as if everything was fine. They did their work the same way they always had. But the air felt different. Not everyone noticed it at first. She did. Not with words, just with a feeling. The rhythm of the mill had always been steady. Now, something about it sounded uncertain. Work hours changed. Not all at once. Just slowly. A weekend cut here. A shorter week there. Temporary at first. Always temporary. Management spoke carefully. They talked about adjustments. They talked about restructuring. They talked about making operations more efficient. Words layered over worry. Soft language covering sharp reality. People nodded politely and tried to believe them. Tried to believe the tone, even when they didn't believe the meaning. She noticed the difference in people's faces. Smiles lasted a little shorter. Laughs sounded thinner. Small jokes didn't land the way they once did. Break room conversations weren't the same. People still talked, still told stories, still shared the little things that made life human. But underneath every conversation lived the same quiet thought. What if this doesn't come back? Nobody wanted to say it out loud, as if speaking it might make it real. Silence felt safer than truth. The machines still roared. The fabric still moved. The thread still snapped and rethreaded and snapped again. Work looked the same, but certainty was gone, even if only she could feel it at first. There was something deeply unsettling about impending change that moved slowly, not like a sudden storm, not like a loud crash, but like a slow dimming of light. You could see enough to keep going, but never enough to feel safe. Then came announcements. Not everything, not final, just enough. More schedule changes, more layoffs in departments she didn't work in, at least not yet. More closures in other towns nearby. Some people left long before they were forced to. Others said they'd stay as long as there was anything to stay for. She stayed, not because she didn't worry, but because this place had shaped her entire life. You don't walk away for something like that easily. And then one day, there was nothing left to wait for. There was no long, dramatic speech, no official ceremony, no grand farewell to decades of human effort. Just a notice, just words printed on paper, just sentences that sounded like they had been written far away by people who didn't know the names of those who had read them. Operations suspended, production ending. Permanent closure. Words that didn't scream. Words that didn't cry. Words that simply removed everything with calm finality. She remembered standing still, hearing the words, but feeling them only slowly. The same way you feel cold seep in gradually. Not shock, a spreading numbness. The machine stopped. The sound that had filled her life for decades disappeared. There was no roar, no endless rhythm, no constant vibration in the air. Just nothing. Silence replaced something that had been as familiar as breathing. Silence where there had always been noise. Silence, she learned, could be louder than machines. It echoed in ways sound never did. You could talk over noise. You could laugh through it. You could exist comfortably beside it. You couldn't outrun silence. It followed you home. It sat at your table. It stayed in your room at night. Silence reminded you of what was missing. Not dramatically, just persistently. After the closure, life didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It unraveled, a little bit at a time. The town changed slowly in ways that would have been hard to explain to anyone who didn't already understand. The diner reduced hours. The grocery store cut staff. A shop closed, then another, then another. Children moved away. Parents followed. Some stayed as long as they could. Buildings didn't vanish. They remained, but they felt emptier. A place could still look like itself and no longer be itself. She felt that deeply. Home didn't feel like before. Not because the walls changed, not because furniture moved, but because something invisible had been removed. For years, her life had been built around purpose. Purpose didn't brag. It didn't shout. It simply existed quietly, shaping everything. When it disappeared, she didn't suddenly feel free. She felt unmoored. Days didn't know where to go anymore. Time stretched in strange directions. Sometimes too slow. Sometimes too fast. Sometimes both at once. She tried to fill it with chores, with small tasks, with anything that created forward motion. But there's a difference between staying busy and having a reason. Work had always done more than earn money. It had given structure, identity, belonging, value. Losing that felt like losing a part of herself nobody had ever taught her how to live without. People sometimes spoke carelessly. They said things like, "At least now you can rest. At least now you have time. At least now you're free." They didn't mean harm. They meant to be kind. But there was a misunderstanding buried inside those words. Freedom didn't feel like this. Rest didn't feel like this. Time didn't feel like a gift. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She never framed herself as a victim. Life had taught her to keep walking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just forward. So she did, even when she didn't always know where forward led anymore. Eventually, acceptance came. Not all at once. Not as a moment. Not as an epiphany. Acceptance arrived like everything else in her life had. Slowly, quietly, steadily. She began to understand that what she had given those years had not disappeared. They still existed in the world somewhere. In clothing worn by lives she never met. In memories held by people who once worked beside her. In the shape of a town that had once been alive with sound. Her years hadn't vanished. They had simply moved into the past. And the past still mattered, even if the world rarely paused to remember it. Sometimes she missed the noise, not because it was pleasant, not because it was gentle, but because it meant people were together. It meant effort was shared. It meant life had momentum. Now, the world around her was quieter, but she was still here, and she was not nothing, just because the mill was gone. This story isn't unique. It happened in North Carolina. It happened across the South. It happened across American towns built on work and held together by people like her. Ordinary women, ordinary lives, extraordinary endurance. Their stories didn't make headlines. They weren't framed as history. They rarely appeared in documentaries or books. But they mattered. They still matter. And they deserve to be remembered before we forgot.